Welcome, dear friends. Today we are going to discuss the topic preserving the linguistic heritage, documentation of endangered languages in the global world. The main objectives of the lecture are to bring into focus the linguistic heritage present in the world, to trace the relationship between language and culture, to focus on the threat of endangerment faced by a large number of languages in the world, to introduce the field of language documentation as a means of recording the endangered languages. Now let us start going for the introduction. One cannot undermine the importance of language in the life of humans. It is the feature of language which makes humans distinct from other creatures and species of the world. A language is a repository of knowledge, and with the loss of a language, this repository is automatically lost. In the recent past, we have witnessed extinction of a good number of languages at the global level, which is worrisome as man needs to preserve the linguistic heritage present in the world. Let us define what linguistic heritage is. The Cambridge English Dictionary defines heritage as, quote, features belonging to the culture of a particular society, such as traditions, language, or buildings that were created in the past and still have historical importance, unquote. Heritage as such refers to the inherited features pertaining to any aspect of a society or a culture. Language is one of the most important social institutions and is probably the basis for the functioning of other systems in the overall social system. Generally, language as a species-specific characteristic is a precious heritage of mankind. However, when it comes to the overall linguistic scenario prevalent in the world, we witness that all the world societies have languages of their own, which have grown in them and have transcended across generations. There is no denying the fact that language and culture are intricately linked. Linguistic heritage can thus be defined as a treasure of linguistic resources or languages inherited by a society. The overall linguistic heritage of the world includes all the languages of the world. The latest edition of the Ethnologue lists almost 7,000 living languages, but the actual number is difficult, arguably impossible to determine because of such factors as the arbitrary distinction between languages and dialects. Now let's come to linguistic heritage vis-a-vis the cultural heritage. Culture can be regarded as the way of life which includes arts, beliefs, and institutions of a population that's passed down from generation to generation. As such, it encompasses codes of manners, dress, religion, rituals, norms of behavior such as law and morality, and systems of belief as well as the art. According to UNESCO, the cultural heritage includes the entire corpus of material science, either artistic or symbolic, handed on by the past to each culture and therefore to the whole of mankind. As a constituent part of affirmation and enrichment of cultural identities, as a legacy belonging to all humankind, the cultural heritage gives each particular place and society its recognizable and distinctive features and is the storehouse of human experience. The preservation and presentation of the cultural heritage are therefore a cornerstone of any cultural policy. Language forms an integral part of culture. In fact, languages seem to be woven into the very fabric of human culture, and to such an extent that it is hard to imagine what human culture would be like without language. The issue regarding the relationship between language and culture can be traced as far back as to the Herder-Humboldt tradition in European anthropology. However, the American anthropologists Edward Sapir and Benjamin Lee Wolfe were the first scholars to focus on the relationship between language and culture. In the 1920s, they formulated and developed a hypothesis which later became known as Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. According to this hypothesis, languages structure our perception of environment, and speakers of different languages react to the same environmental stimulus differently. Following this discussion, one can easily perceive that language and culture have a homologous, although complex relationship with each other. Given this backdrop, it is said that language is culture and culture is language. Now let's come to the relationship between language and identity. Languages are often seen as symbols of ethnic and national identity. Many endangered language campaigners claim that when a language dies, a unique way of looking at the world also disappears. For example, Fishman, Nettle, Romain, Dolby have talked about this. This can be seen as a weak version of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which claims that our way of thinking, and thus our cultural identity, is determined by the lexicon and syntax of our language. Carroll and Mandelbaum have worked on this. Language is one of the ways in which people construct their identities. As Lanza and Swinson suggest, quote, language might become important for identity when a group feels it is losing its identity due to political or social reasons, unquote. There is no denying the fact that, quote, a mother tongue is the expression of primary identification of human being, and the loss of which results in the loss of rootedness in tradition and mythology of the speech community, and leads to intellectual impoverishment and emotional sterility, unquote. Patnaik has said this. Now let's talk about what is language endangerment. Language endangerment is a serious concern to which linguists and language planners have turned their attention to in the last several decades. For a host of reasons, speakers of many smaller and less dominant languages stop using their heritage language and begin using some other language. Parents may begin to use only that second language with their children, and gradually the intergenerational transmission of the heritage language is reduced and may even cease. As a consequence, there may be no speakers who use the language as their first or primary language, and eventually the language may no longer be used at all. A language may thus become dormant or extinct, existing perhaps only in recordings or written records and transcriptions. There are two dimensions to the characterization of endangerment: the number of users who identify with a particular language, and the number and nature of the uses or functions for which the language is employed. A language may be endangered because there are fewer and fewer people who claim that language as their own, and therefore neither use it nor pass it on to their children. It may also or alternatively be endangered because it is being used for fewer and fewer daily activities, and so loses the characteristically close association of the language with particular social or communicative functions. Form follows function, and languages which are being used for fewer and fewer domains of life also tend to lose structural complexity, which in turn may affect the perceptions of users regarding the suitability of the language for use in a broader set of functions. This can lead to a downward spiral which eventually results in the complete loss of the language. Let's go now to the current scenario. Looking at the linguistic scenario at the global level, there are about 7,000 living languages in the world, which are unevenly distributed in terms of the number of speakers. The top 30 languages in the world account for more than 60% of its population. At the other end of the scale, we find that most languages are spoken by quite small communities. Half of the world's languages have fewer than 7,000 speakers each, less than a village. What's more striking is that 80% of the world's languages have fewer than 100,000 speakers, the size of a small town. The table on the screen provides data on the world's smallest languages as per Ethnologue, portrays the number of languages with least number of speakers. As is clear from the figures, 1,619 languages have less than 1,000 speakers, which clearly depict their state of endangerment. In view of this scenario, linguists are concerned about the fact that many languages are threatened and are at the verge of extinction. According to one estimate by Cross, half of the languages spoken in the world today will have gone extinct by the end of this century. This means that, on average, the last speaker of some language dies every 2 weeks. Language extinction is witnessed all over the globe. In India, Koi have disappeared. Irish and Scottish Gaelic are endangered, while Cornish, Non, and Manx Gaelic have disappeared in Europe. Romani, the idiomatic language of the Gypsies, is in the critical list, and the indigenous languages in Australia, which once boasted 250 different languages, have now reduced to about 20. During the pre-Columbian era, Brazil had 1,200 languages, out of which only 170 remain now. And even among these, most are heading towards oblivion. Before the arrival of the Europeans, North America possessed between 600 and 700 languages, which were reduced to 213 only by the middle of 20th century. At least 200 of Africa's approximately 2,000 languages are dying out. Ethnologue classifies 516 languages as nearly extinct because they are spoken by only a few elderly speakers. The table on the screen shows the number of nearly extinct languages in major world areas. You can see different areas: the Pacific, the Americans, Asia 78, then Africa 46, Europe 12, and total 516 languages. Now come to language endangerment vis-a-vis globalization and global dominance of English. To some students of language, globalization is the number one culprit behind this development. That is, endangerment at faster pace in the last few decades. Michael Cross, an anthropologist from University of Alaska, believes that modern information and communication technologies, so intimately connected with globalization, are responsible for strangulation of these languages. Leaving aside its economic, political, and socio-cultural implications, globalization encompasses fearsome linguistic consequences. Being labeled as the euphemistic contraction of global civilization, globalization implicitly works for the use and dominance of a global language, that's English. It has a penetrating and long-lasting impact on the languages of the world. Nowadays, language has become, quote, a saleable commodity, and only the languages which can serve as the languages of opportunity in different spheres at the national and international level are going to flourish in this global world. In view of the present circumstances, one can easily perceive English to be, quote, the language of globalization, as it, quote, has penetrated deeply into the international domains of political life, business, safety, communication, entertainment, media, and education, unquote. As such, it is being prophesied that, quote, the much talked about global village has only English. All other languages, irrespective of their status today in their countries, will be local languages in that glorious global village, unquote. Let us go to why is language endangerment worrisome. It needs to be borne in mind that language is not merely a cluster of words or a set of grammatical rules. Rather, in the words of Davies, it is, quote, a flesh of the human spirit by which the soul of a culture reaches into the material world, unquote. According to Cross, language is, quote, as divine and mysterious as a living organism, as has been quoted in Davies' 1999. Language forms the bedrock of a culture's worldview and values and is regarded as key to the individual and community identity. Therefore, threat to a language is tantamount to threat to the identity of a people. There is no denying the fact that, quote, when a language is under threat, so is people's identity. When a language dies, the world loses that unique expression of culture and worldview and the linguistic uniqueness it represents, unquote. As such, language endangerment and the tendency of the speakers to shift to language of wider communication, especially varieties of English, means that unless the myriad inventive ways used by the humans to express themselves are not documented now, future generations may not be aware of them. For example, Ubaic, a Caucasian language whose last fully competent speaker died in 1992, has 84 distinct consonants and, according to some analyses, only 2 phonological vowels. This is the smallest proportion of vowels to consonants known, and the possibility of such a language would have been unheard of if linguists such as George de Maizière, Hans Swart, and George Hewitt had not recorded the last fluent speaker, namely Tawfiq Assange, before he died and analyzed the language. Cross called for, quote, some rethinking of our priorities, lest linguistics goes down in history as the only science that has presided obliviously over the disappearance of 90% of the very field to which it is dedicated, unquote. The documentation of languages is important in the present scenario, where a number of languages are facing endangerment and as such have put at stake various aspects like cultural heritage, knowledge system, linguistic system, identities, and other things associated with them. It will lead to the extinction of not only the linguistic systems, but all these other aspects also. Now, let us come to what is language documentation. Language documentation, also known as documentary linguistics, is the subfield of linguistics that deals with creating multi-purpose records of languages through audio and video recording of speakers with annotation, translation, preservation, and distribution of the resulting materials. It is multidisciplinary in nature and draws on theoretical concepts and methods from linguistics, ethnography, folklore studies, psychology, information and library science, archiving and museum studies, digital humanities, media and recording arts, pedagogy, ethics, and other research areas. Its major goal is the creation of well-organized, long-lasting corpora that can be used for a variety of purposes, including theoretical research and practical needs such as language and cultural revitalization. Historically, the term language documentation has been used in linguistics to refer to the creation of grammars, dictionaries, and text collections for previously undescribed languages. However, works defining language documentation as a distinct subfield of linguistics emerged around 1995 as a response to the crisis facing the world's endangered languages and the urgent need to record and analyze languages and speakers' linguistic knowledge while they continue to be spoken, and to work with communities on supporting threatened languages before opportunities to do so become reduced. It was also prompted by developments in information, media, communication, and archiving technologies, which make possible the collection, analysis, preservation, and dissemination of documentary records in ways that were not feasible previously. It was also facilitated by high levels of research funding support from three main sources, which are the Documentation of Endangered Languages program sponsored by Volkswagen Foundation in Germany from 2000 to 2013, the Endangered Languages Documentation Program supported by Arcadia Trust in the United Kingdom from 2002 to 2016, and the Documenting Endangered Languages Interagency Initiative of the US National Science Foundation and the National Endowment of the Humanities 2005, and it is continuing. In a nutshell, language documentation concerns itself with principles and methods for recording and analysis of primary language and cultural materials and metadata about them in ways that are transparent and accountable, and that can be archived and disseminated for current and future generations to use. Let's come to methodology of language documentation. The process of documentation goes through many steps. The main steps and tools for documentation of languages are discussed here. First, selecting a language for documentation. The process of documentation starts with identification of a language. There are various guidelines laid down by the institutions which have undertaken the projects related to the documentation of endangered and lesser known languages. The guidelines evolved by the committee set by the Central Institute of Indian Languages, Mysore, suggests that the documentation at the first place is essential for the mother tongues spoken by less than 10,000 speakers, and the languages must figure in the list of languages on Ethnologue. Number 2, selecting an ideal informant. The selection criteria for informants vary with the purpose of the documentation. For example, a sociolinguistic study would require the social factors like age, gender, profession, etc. to be taken into consideration. While as for descriptive studies, the social variables need not be taken into account. The common criteria for an ideal informant are: informant must be a native speaker, born, brought up, and one who continues to live in the ethnic settlement and has to be fluent in the language. Informant must have all the teeth and other vocal organs intact in order to elicit actual sound features of a language. That is, the informant must not be having any speech disorder. Informant should have the knowledge about the history and migration of the community. Choose preferably the informant who knows and actively participates in the social, religious, and cultural practices of the community. Let's go to data recording. For recording the data, a good technical support in the form of recorders, audio and video both, is required. Those undertaking documentation should be properly trained for using the equipments. Apart from the use of equipments, the linguists must be trained to make a good rapport with the informants. The data should be collected only when the informant is relaxed. The informant must be asked to repeat each word and sentence thrice. If necessary, pictures and videos should be shot for keeping the better record of the data. Number 4. Fieldwork ethics. Fieldwork is a social act, and as such, it carries with it a moral responsibility. A cooperative model needs to be employed during the data collection, which in its strongest form explores, empowers speech communities, research on, for and within a community. Some of the important ethical considerations for fieldwork are: informed consent should be taken for carrying out a work in a community. Consent should also be taken from the administrative heads where the work is being carried out. Researchers must not breach the privacy of the informants. Let's conclude now. Everyone is familiar with the adage that no man is an island entirely of itself. This goes to say that man is a social being, and thus he imbibes social norms, traditions, and culture. It is language which makes all this possible. Thus, language and society are unimaginable without each other. Societies are distinctive and give rise to cultures of their own. The things and state of affairs in a society constitute knowledge, which gets enshrined in a specific code, the language of that society. The endangerment or the loss of a language would thus account for the loss of the huge cultural heritage. Language endangerment, as such, is a serious concern to which linguists and language planners have turned their attention to in the last several decades. It is estimated that if nothing is done, half of the over 7,000 languages spoken today will disappear by the end of this century. With the disappearance of unwritten and undocumented languages, humanity would lose not only an irreplaceable cultural heritage, but also valuable ancestral knowledge embedded in particular in indigenous languages. However, this process is neither inevitable nor irreversible. Well-planned and effectively implemented language policies can bolster ongoing efforts of speaker communities to maintain or revitalize their mother tongues and pass them on to younger generations. The UNESCO thus came up with the Endangered Languages Program to protect and preserve the languages that are endangered. In line with different programs aimed at protection and preservation of indigenous languages, language documentation is carried out as a universal tool for this purpose, which has tremendous significance given the present linguistic scenario at the global level. With this, we come to the end of today's lecture. Hope you have enjoyed it well. Thanks for watching.